The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves across the yard of the Colorado Territory Children's Home. As Edmund Carter pulled his wagon to a stop in front of the imposing brick building. At 55 years old, Edmund had never married, never had children of his own, and his ranch outside Denver desperately needed young hands to help with the upcoming winter. Preparations. Mrs. Prudence Hartwell, the stern matron who had run the institution for 15 years, greeted Edmund with the businesslike efficiency of someone conducting a familiar transaction. Her gray dress and severe hairstyle seemed designed to drain warmth from any interaction, and her pale eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who viewed children as problems to be managed rather than people to be nurtured. "Mr. Carter, I have several boys who would be suitable for ranch work," she announced, leading him through corridors that echoed with an unnatural silence. "All are accustomed to hard labor and understand the value of strict discipline." Edmund followed her through the institution, noting the way children seemed to shrink into themselves when Mrs. Hartwell appeared. The walls were painted an institutional green that seemed designed to sap hope from anyone who looked at them too long, and the few children he glimpsed moved with the careful quietness of those who had learned that drawing attention meant inviting trouble. They entered a large workroom where perhaps 20 boys, ranging in age from 10 to 16, sat at long wooden tables performing repetitive tasks, sorting screws, folding papers, and other busy work designed more to occupy hands than to teach useful skills. The boys looked up briefly as the adults entered, then quickly returned their attention to their assigned tasks. "This is Robert Fletcher," Mrs. Hartwell said, stopping beside a sturdy boy of about 14. "Strong, reliable, rarely requires correction. He would serve you well." Edmund studied Robert's face, seeing competence and resignation there, but also a deadness behind the eyes that troubled him. This was a boy who had learned to survive by becoming invisible, by never hoping for too much. "And this is William Hayes," the matron continued, indicating a slightly older boy with broad shoulders, 16 years old, experienced with heavy work, very obedient. Again, Edmund saw the same careful emptiness, the same protective numbness that suggested these children had learned that feeling too much led only to disappointment and pain. "Are there others?" Edmund asked, something in his gut telling him that what he was looking for wasn't in this room of broken spirits. Mrs. Hartwell's expression tightened with disapproval. "There's one other possibility, though I hesitate to recommend him. He's been difficult to manage." She led Edmund to a smaller room where a solitary boy sat reading a worn book, his back straight despite the uncomfortable wooden chair. The child appeared to be about 12 years old, with auburn hair that needed cutting and clothes that had been mended multiple times. When he looked up from his reading, Edmund saw something entirely different from the others: intelligence, spirit, and a defiance that all the institutional discipline hadn't managed to crush. "This is Thomas Murphy," Mrs. Hartwell said with obvious distaste, 12 years old. "Arrived here 2 years ago after his parents died in a mine collapse. He's intelligent enough, but he has a stubborn streak and a tendency toward insubordination. That makes him unsuitable for most placements." Thomas set down his book and stood to face the visitors, his chin raised in a gesture of quiet dignity that was remarkable in someone so young. Edmund noticed that the book was a collection of poetry, hardly typical reading material for a boy in an orphanage. "What kind of insubordination?" Edmund asked, his curiosity piqued despite Mrs. Hartwell's obvious warning. "He questions authority, argues with instructions, and shows an unfortunate tendency to defend younger children when they're being disciplined." The matron replied sharply, "Just yesterday, he had to be corrected for interfering when we were teaching proper behavior to one of the smaller boys." Edmund looked into Thomas's eyes and saw a flicker of something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed. This was a child who still believed in right and wrong, even after 2 years in an institution designed to break such beliefs. "What kind of correction did he receive?" Edmund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mrs. Hartwell's smile was coldly satisfied. "We believe in firm discipline, Mr. Carter. Spare the rod and spoil the child, as Scripture teaches." Thomas received 10 strokes with the strap for his interference. Edmund felt a chill of anger at the casual cruelty in the woman's voice, but he kept his expression neutral. "Thomas, can you tell me what you were reading?" The boy's response revealed both his intelligence and his courage. "Poems by Mr. Longfellow, sir. They help me remember that there's beauty in the world, even when it's hard to see." "And what was this interference that got you in trouble?" Thomas glanced nervously at Mrs. Hartwell before answering. "There's a little boy named Peter who sometimes has accidents because he's scared. Yesterday he wet himself during lessons, and Mrs. Hartwell was going to whip him for it. I just said that maybe he couldn't help it. That maybe being frightened made it worse." The simple explanation revealed everything Edmund needed to know about Thomas Murphy's character. Here was a boy who, despite facing punishment himself, had been willing to speak up for someone smaller and more vulnerable. Double quotes Mr. Carter. Mrs. Hartwell interjected, "I must warn you that Thomas has been a disruptive influence since his arrival. His parents filled his head with inappropriate ideas about fairness and compassion that make him unsuitable for situations requiring strict obedience." Edmund studied Thomas's face, seeing past the institutional uniform to the bright, determined spirit underneath. "Thomas, have you ever done farm work?" "No, sir. But I learned quickly, and I'm not afraid of hard work," Thomas replied. "My father taught me that honest labor is something to be proud of, no matter how difficult it might be." The answer revealed the kind of values that Edmund respected, the understanding that work was about more than just completing tasks. "What would you say if I told you that ranch work is demanding, that it requires getting up before dawn and working until after dark?" Thomas's response came without hesitation. "I'd say that sounds better than sitting in this room sorting screws for 10 hours a day, sir. At least on a ranch, the work would mean something." Edmund made his decision with the same instinct that had guided him through 30 years of successful ranching. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'll take Thomas." The matron's shock was evident. "Mr. Carter, surely you can see that Robert or William would be much more suitable. Thomas will only cause you problems with his questioning and arguing." "Maybe," Edmund agreed, "but he'll also bring something the others won't, the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult." As they completed the paperwork for Thomas's indenture, Edmund found himself answering the boy's endless questions about ranch life, cattle care, and the challenges of mountain agriculture. Thomas's enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Edmund of his own early days when every aspect of ranching had seemed like an adventure. The wagon ride to Edmund's ranch took them through some of Colorado's most spectacular country, climbing steadily into the foothills where golden aspen groves blazed against dark evergreen forests. Thomas watched everything with wide eyes, drinking in his first taste of freedom in 2 years. "It's beautiful," Thomas breathed, his face pressed to the wagon's side as they passed through a particularly stunning valley. "I never imagined country could look like this." Edmund felt an unexpected surge of pride in his homeland. "It's not easy country, Thomas. The winters can be brutal, and the work is harder than anything you've experienced. But there's nowhere else I'd rather be." As they crested the final ridge before Edmund's property, the ranch came into view, a sturdy log house with a stone chimney, a large barn, and several corrals surrounded by pastures where cattle grazed contentedly in the afternoon sun. "This is home," Edmund said simply, watching Thomas's face light up with wonder. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace after a simple supper, Edmund began to explain what life on the ranch would be like. "Thomas, I need you to understand something important. The work here is hard, but it's fair. You'll be expected to do your share, but you'll also be treated with respect." Thomas looked up from the book Edmund had given him, his expression serious. "Mr. Carter, at the orphanage, they told us that children like me should be grateful for whatever treatment we receive, that we don't deserve better because we're nobody's children." Edmund felt his jaw tighten with anger at the cruelty that had been inflicted on this bright, sensitive boy. "Thomas, let me tell you something, and I want you to remember it. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. You're not nobody's child anymore. You're my responsibility, and that means something." As Thomas prepared for bed in the small but comfortable room Edmund had prepared for him, the boy asked the question, that had been weighing on his mind since leaving the orphanage. "Mr. Carter, what happens if I make mistakes? What happens if I'm not strong enough or fast enough to do the work properly?" Edmund's answer came from the heart of a man who understood that children needed both challenges and compassion to grow properly. "Thomas, everyone makes mistakes when they're learning. The important thing is that you try your best and learn from whatever goes wrong. Nobody here will punish you for honest mistakes or for not being perfect." As Thomas settled into his first real bed in 2 years, Edmund reflected on the decision he had made. Taking on a traumatized orphan boy was a risk that could complicate his life considerably. But something about Thomas's spirit and courage had convinced him that this was the right choice. What Edmund couldn't know was that within days, his commitment to treating Thomas with dignity would be tested in ways he never could have anticipated, and that the boy's courage would prove to be exactly the kind of strength his ranch needed most. 3 weeks into Thomas Murphy's life on Edmund Carter's ranch, the boy had proven himself to be everything Edmund had hoped for and more. Despite his small size and lack of experience, Thomas attacked every task with determination and intelligence that made up for what he lacked in strength. His eagerness to learn and genuine care for the animals had quickly made him indispensable around the ranch. The morning that would test both their characters began like any other, with Thomas helping Edmund load hay bales onto the wagon for transport to the cattle in the far pasture. The October air was crisp with the promise of approaching winter, and both man and boy worked with the focused urgency that came with preparing for Colorado's harsh cold season. "Careful with those bales, Thomas," Edmund called as the boy struggled with a particularly heavy bundle. "Don't try to lift more than you can handle safely." Thomas nodded, his face flushed with exertion, but determined not to show any sign of weakness. At 12 years old and slight of build, he was attempting to do work that would challenge boys much larger and stronger. But his pride refused to let him ask for help with tasks he felt he should be able to manage alone. It was that pride that led to disaster. As Thomas wrestled a heavy bale toward the wagon's edge, his foot slipped on a patch of frost slickwood. The bale tumbled from his grasp, bouncing off the wagon bed and splitting open as it hit the ground. Precious hay scattered across the barnyard, much of it now contaminated with dirt and debris that would make it unsuitable for feeding the cattle. Thomas stared at the mess in horror, his face going pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Winter hay was expensive and sometimes impossible to replace, and he had just wasted enough to feed several cattle for days. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I know it was careless and stupid," and his words were cut off by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders were coming up the lane toward the ranch, and Edmund recognized them with a sinking heart. Jake Morrison, the local cattle buyer, was accompanied by his 2 sons, hard men who had a reputation for sharp dealing and harsh judgment. "Morning, Edmund," Jake called as they dismounted near the barn. "Heard you've taken on one of those orphan boys from the Denver home. Thought we'd stop by and see how he's working out." Edmund felt a chill of foreboding as he saw Jake's eyes take in the scattered hay and Thomas's obvious distress. The cattle buyer had strong opinions about discipline and order, and he wouldn't hesitate to share them. "Looks like the boy's been clumsy with your winter feed," Jake observed with obvious disapproval. "That's expensive hay he's wasted there." Thomas stepped forward, his young voice shaking but clear. "It was my fault, sir. Mr. Carter told me to be careful, but I tried to lift too much and lost my grip. I take full responsibility for the waste." Jake's eldest son, Bill Morrison, laughed harshly. "Listen to that, Pa. The orphan boy thinks taking responsibility is enough. Back when we were kids, that kind of carelessness would have earned a whipping that taught us to be more careful next time." "That's right," Jake agreed, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to having his opinions treated as law. "Edmund, if you don't correct this kind of behavior firmly, you'll have nothing but trouble from here on out. These orphan children need to learn that actions have consequences." Edmund felt his anger rising at the casual cruelty in Jake's voice, but before he could respond, Thomas surprised everyone by speaking up. "They whipped me for dropping hay at the orphanage too," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the obvious fear in his eyes. Mrs. Hartwell said it would teach me to be more careful, but it only taught me to be more afraid. The simple statement hung in the cold air like smoke from a fire. Jake Morrison's face darkened with anger at what he perceived as insubordination. From a child who should know his place, you see, Jake said to Edmund, the boy's got no respect, no understanding of proper discipline. If he were mine, I'd take a strap to him right now and teach him some manners along with some caution. Edmund looked at Thomas, seeing the way the boy's shoulders were set with quiet dignity despite his obvious fear. Here was a child who had already endured brutal punishment for honest mistakes, yet he was willing to stand up and take responsibility rather than make excuses or blame others. Jake, Edmund said carefully, I appreciate your concern, but I handle discipline on my own ranch in my own way. And what way is that? Bill Morrison challenged. Letting orphan boys waste your property without any consequences. That's not discipline. That's foolishness. Edmund's decision came from deep conviction about right and wrong, about the difference between correction and cruelty. Thomas, go to the barn and start cleaning up that hay. Save what you can and set aside what's too dirty to use. As Thomas hurried away, obviously grateful to escape the confrontation, Jake Morrison shook his head in disgust. Edmund, you're making a mistake. That boy needs to learn that carelessness costs, and the only way to teach that lesson is with a firm hand. You mean like this? Edmund asked, walking to the barn and returning with the leather strap he used for various ranch tasks. You think I should beat a 12-year-old boy for an accident that happened because he was trying to do work that's really too heavy for someone his size? Exactly like that. Jake replied firmly, spare the rod and spoil the child. It's biblical wisdom, and it works. Edmund looked at the strap in his hands, then at the three men who were waiting to see him use it on a frightened child. His decision came from the same place that had led him to choose Thomas over the other orphans, from his understanding of what it meant to be a man of character. You're right, Jake, Edmund said quietly. Someone needs to be punished for what happened here today. He raised the strap high and brought it down hard across his own back, the leather cracking like a gunshot in the cold air. The pain was sharp and immediate, but Edmund's expression remained steady as he raised the strap again. Mr. Carter, no, Thomas cried, running back from the barn where he had been gathering the scattered hay. Please don't hurt yourself because of my mistake. Edmund brought the strap down again, his face grim with determination. This is the punishment that Jake thinks someone deserves for dropping hay, Thomas. If he's right about discipline, then this should teach all of us to be more careful. The three visitors stared in shock as Edmund prepared to strike himself a third time. Jake Morrison's face had gone pale with understanding of the point being made. Edmund, stop, Jake said uncomfortably. There's no need for this kind of demonstration. Why not? Edmund asked, the strap still raised. You said carelessness needed to be punished with pain. You said it was the only way to teach lessons that would be remembered. Shouldn't I practice what you're preaching? Thomas stepped between Edmund and the strap, his small body shaking with emotion, but his voice strong. Please, Mr. Carter, I understand what you're trying to show them, but please don't hurt yourself for me. Edmund lowered the strap and placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. Son, sometimes the most important lessons aren't learned through pain. They're learned through understanding that we all make mistakes, and that forgiveness and second chances are often more powerful than punishment. Jake Morrison mounted his horse without another word, his sons following in uncomfortable silence. As they rode away, Edmund could see that his demonstration had made its point more effectively than any argument could have. Mr. Carter, Thomas said quietly, why did you do that? Why did you take the punishment that they wanted you to give to me? Edmund's answer came from the heart of a man who understood that protecting others was sometimes the most important thing an adult could do. Because, Thomas, sometimes standing up for what's right means being willing to take the consequences yourself. And because no child should ever be hurt for making an honest mistake. While trying their best, that evening, as they worked together to repair the damage from the scattered hay, Thomas asked the question that had been weighing on his mind all day. At the orphanage, they told us that we deserved punishment because we were unwanted, because we were burdens on society. Was that true? Edmund's response was immediate and firm. Thomas, that was a lie designed to make you easier to control. Every child deserves kindness, patience, and the chance to learn from their mistakes without fear. You're not a burden, you're a gift. Will Edmund's radical approach to discipline change how Thomas sees himself? How will their relationship evolve? As winter approaches, subscribe to our channel to witness the powerful bond that forms when an adult chooses protection over punishment. The harsh Colorado winter that followed Edmund Carter's dramatic stand against cruelty proved to be a crucible that forged an unbreakable bond between the rancher and his young charge. Thomas Murphy, freed from the fear of brutal punishment for honest mistakes, blossomed into the kind of worker and companion Edmund had never dared hope for. By February, Thomas had grown visibly stronger and more confident, his small frame filling out with proper food and his spirit strengthening under Edmund's patient guidance. More importantly, he had developed the kind of initiative and problem-solving ability that came from knowing his ideas would be heard and his efforts appreciated rather than criticized. "Mr. Carter, I've been thinking about the cattle feeding situation," Thomas said one morning as they prepared to break ice on the water troughs. "What if we moved the hay storage closer to the winter pasture? We'd save time and effort, and the cattle would have more consistent access to feed." Edmund paused in his work to consider the suggestion seriously. Over the months, he had learned to listen carefully to Thomas's ideas, finding that the boy's fresh perspective often revealed solutions that his own experience had overlooked. "That's smart thinking, Thomas," Edmund replied. "Show me what you have in mind." Thomas had prepared detailed sketches showing how they could relocate their feeding operations to reduce labor and improve care for their livestock. The plans demonstrated not just intelligence, but the kind of strategic thinking that suggested real aptitude for ranch management. "We could build a temporary shelter here," Thomas explained, pointing to a spot that would provide natural wind protection while remaining accessible during heavy snow. It would mean less travel time for us and less stress on the cattle during feeding. The project they undertook together over the next weeks became a symbol of their partnership. Edmund provided experience and resources while Thomas contributed innovation and boundless energy. Working side by side, they built something that was better than either could have achieved alone. Their collaboration hadn't gone unnoticed in the surrounding community. Word had spread about Edmund's confrontation with Jake Morrison and his unconventional approach to discipline. Some neighbors viewed his methods with skepticism, but others were beginning to see the remarkable results of treating a child with respect rather than fear. "That boy of yours is something special," Dr. William Patterson, the local physician, told Edmund during one of his visits to check on a sick calf. "I've seen children who were broken by harsh treatment, and I've seen others who thrived under kindness." Thomas is proof of what happens when someone believes in a child's potential. The validation from respected community members meant a great deal to Edmund, but it was Thomas's own transformation that provided the real measure of their success. The frightened, defensive orphan had become a confident young man who approached challenges with enthusiasm rather than fear. Spring brought new tests of their partnership when a late blizzard threatened their cattle herd. The storm struck without warning, trapping dozens of animals in remote areas where they could freeze or starve before rescue arrived. "We'll need to reach the cattle in the north pasture," Edmund told Thomas as they assessed the situation from their kitchen window. "The snow's too deep for the wagon, which means we'll have to go on foot with supplies." Thomas was already putting on his heaviest coat. "I know where they like to shelter during storms. If we follow the creek bed, we can reach them even in deep snow." The rescue operation that followed tested both their endurance and their trust in each other. For 12 hours, they struggled through snow drifts that sometimes reached Thomas's chest, carrying feed and medical supplies to cattle that would have died without their intervention. "I can't feel my feet anymore," Thomas admitted as they reached the last group of stranded animals, his voice chattering with cold but his determination unshaken. Edmund looked at the boy who was pushing himself beyond normal limits to save animals that had come to depend on their care. "Thomas, you've done more than enough. Head back to the house and get warm. I can finish here alone." "No, sir," Thomas replied firmly. "We started this together, and we'll finish it together. These cattle are counting on both of us." The stubborn loyalty in Thomas's voice reminded Edmund of why he had chosen this particular boy. From all the options at the orphanage, here was someone who understood that commitment meant more than just doing what was easy or comfortable. By evening, they had saved every animal in their herd, though the effort had pushed both of them to the edge of exhaustion. As they sat by the fire, sharing hot coffee and assessing the day's work, Edmund reflected on how much their relationship had changed since that first morning, when Thomas had dropped the hay. "Thomas, do you remember what you told Jake Morrison about being whipped for dropping hay at the orphanage?" Thomas nodded, his expression growing serious. "I remember. You showed them that punishment doesn't teach the lessons they thought it did. What lessons has this ranch taught you instead?" Thomas considered the question with the careful thought he brought to everything important. "It taught me that mistakes are opportunities to learn, not crimes to be punished. It taught me that when adults trust children to think and contribute, they usually rise to meet those expectations. Most importantly, it taught me that kindness is stronger than cruelty." Edmund felt a deep satisfaction at Thomas's answer, recognizing the wisdom that had grown from their months of working together as partners rather than master and servant. Their success hadn't gone unnoticed by others in the community who were struggling with their own challenges. Parents dealing with difficult children began seeking Edmund's advice, curious about his methods and the remarkable results they had produced. "How do you get Thomas to work so hard without using harsh discipline?" asked Sarah Mitchell, whose own teenage son had become rebellious and uncooperative. "Every child needs firm correction to learn proper behavior." Edmund's answer had become a philosophy he applied to every aspect of their life. "Together, Sarah, I've learned that children will work harder for respect than they ever will for fear. When Thomas makes a mistake, we figure out how to prevent it from happening again rather than just punishing him for what went wrong." The conversation took place in front of Thomas, who had been helping Edmund repair fence posts while the adults talked. Edmund noticed the boy's proud smile at being treated as a valued member of their team rather than just a subject to be discussed. As Thomas's 14th birthday approached, Edmund found himself considering the boy's future beyond their ranch. Thomas had grown intellectually as well as physically, devouring every book Edmund could find and showing particular aptitude for mathematics and engineering concepts that suggested potential for advanced education. "Thomas, have you given any thought to what you'd like to do with your life?" Edmund asked one evening as they reviewed plans for expanding their cattle operation. "You've got abilities that could take you far beyond ranching if that's what you wanted." Thomas's answer revealed how completely his perspective had changed from the frightened child who had arrived at the ranch. "Mr. Carter, this ranch has been my salvation. Working with you has taught me that there's dignity in honest labor and satisfaction in building something worthwhile. I'd like to keep doing that, even if it means giving up opportunities for education and advancement in the cities, especially because it means that." Thomas replied firmly, "This ranch has shown me that the most important education comes from understanding how to treat people with respect and how to create something valuable through hard work and fair dealing." Edmund felt his throat tighten with emotion at Thomas's words. The boy's loyalty was deeply touching, but more than that, his understanding of what truly mattered in life showed a wisdom that many adults never achieved. "Thomas, what would you say if I told you that I've been thinking about making you a full partner in this ranch, not just a worker, but someone with an equal say in decisions and an equal share in profits?" Thomas's response came after a long moment of consideration. "I'd say that you've already been treating me like a partner for months. Making it official would just be recognizing what we've both known for a while." As they prepared the legal documents that would formalize their partnership, Edmund reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He had gone to the orphanage looking for hired help and had found something far more valuable: a son in all but name, a partner who shared his values, and proof that treating children with dignity produced better results than any amount of harsh discipline ever could. The ceremony signing their partnership agreement was simple but meaningful, witnessed by Dr. Patterson and several neighbors who had watched their relationship develop with admiration and respect. "Edmund, what you've accomplished with Thomas is remarkable. Dr. Patterson said as they celebrated their new legal partnership, "You've proven that children respond better to trust than to fear, better to respect than to punishment." Edmund looked at Thomas, now officially his equal partner despite being only 14 years old, and saw the confident young man who had emerged from the frightened orphan he had rescued from institutional cruelty. "Dr. Patterson, the most important thing I've learned is that every child deserves someone who believes in their potential." Thomas didn't need punishment for his mistakes. He needed someone who understood that mistakes are how we learn to do better. From whipped orphan to equal partner, Thomas's incredible transformation proves that kindness achieves what cruelty never can. Edmund's courage in standing against traditional harsh discipline shows that protecting children creates stronger bonds than punishing them ever could. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of adults who choose compassion over cruelty and change young lives forever.